I'd like to welcome you to the 2015 Henderson Conference in Church and Ministry. I am Helen Blyer, and it is my privilege to serve as Director of Continuing Education here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. It's great to see some familiar faces and to be introduced to some new ones as well. We are celebrating alum days here at the seminary, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to those graduates of the class of 1965 who are celebrating their 50th graduation anniversary. If any of them are here, could you please rise so we can recognize you? I would also like to extend a grateful welcome to the members of the broader community who have come today because of their interest in our speaker, including Mr. Rick Miller, who is a member of the Association of Lincoln Presenters, who will be here for photographs and to enjoy the lectures as well. I would be remiss if I didn't encourage all of you to review our continuing education materials and remind you that there will be two other lectures after this one at 2 o'clock this afternoon and then 4 o'clock. 3 different lectures. Please consider attending. We want to make sure that we have your contact information. Just as a quick show of hands, how many of you received the paper materials and that's how you found out about this conference? Just a quick show of hands. Did any of you receive any electronic information through Facebook or email? Okay, a few of you. And how many of you were referred by friends of yours who did receive the information? Excellent. If we do not have your contact information directly, please make sure that you fill out an information slip and put it in the fishbowl. We will be having a drawing for all those, from all of those who have submitted their names for a copy of either A. Lincoln or Eloquent President signed by Ron White. So if you'd like a chance at winning a book and you'd like to find out more about our programming here in continuing education, we'd love to have your contact information. And many of you know, of course, we have copies of our guest's book here for sale today. Please stop by the table in the back. The Henderson Conference focuses broadly on church and ministry, and it's named for the Reverend J. Hubert, or Hub, Henderson, who was a director on the board of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for 27 years, serving as president of the board for part of that period. He was a graduate of Muskingum College and Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and he came to Greentree, Pennsylvania to begin his pastorate, which he served from 1944 and then stayed on at Wallace Memorial Presbyterian Church until his retirement in 1979. It's a 35-year pastorate. He taught a deep commitment to the church and to a steady flow of seminarians who came to Wallace Presbyterian each year for their field education, and as well to the congregation that loved him dearly. Congregations, colleagues in ministry, family, and friends joined together to establish this memorial conference in memory of Hub. And I would like to introduce to you and welcome specially members of the Henderson family in attendance today. We have with us today Dick and Sheila, Marge and Ed, and Tom. So if you could rise so we could recognize you, I'd appreciate it. We're grateful to the gift your family has given us in sponsoring and seeing to the endowment of these lectures. The power of the Word. That's what we spent a good portion of our time discussing in the car last night as we drove in from the airport. The power of the Word. The power of the Word to shape, to construct, to reflect, to exhort, to persuade, to join. It's the means by which we understood God to have created and by which the incarnated Christ was named in the Gospel of John. Words are an integral part of what it means for us to be human. We have here with us today someone who himself knows the power of words and has dedicated himself to studying them, crafting them, sharing them, and teaching others about the beauty of engaging with them in depth. He is here to share with us his scholarship in and love for the words of Abraham Lincoln, our most eloquent president. Our guest is Ronald C. White, Jr., the author of 3 remarkable books about Lincoln, among other books. These include the best-selling and award-winning A. Lincoln, a biography. This biography won the coveted Christopher Award in 2010, an award that salutes books that affirm the highest values of the human spirit. He also wrote Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the second inaugural, and The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words. He possesses a portfolio and a set of commitments that are not always found in the same person. A deep commitment to and love for significant and high-level scholarship, a love for the nurture and vitality of the church and its leadership, and the capacity to share his insights in what one might call a secular or more popular audience. To this point, he has lectured at the White House and has been interviewed on the PBS NewsHour. He has taught at UCLA, Princeton Theological Seminary, Whitworth University, Colorado College, Rider University, and of course, San Francisco Theological Seminary. He now serves as a fellow at Huntington Library, visiting professor of history at UCLA, and a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. And he is, and this is what I find tremendously exciting, part of a leadership team that is imagining and developing a new and innovative seminary in Southern California. That's some retirement. Ron White wrote, "After his failed political career, Lincoln often pondered the question of the purpose of the meaning of life. In 1850, 10 years before he was elected president, Lincoln told his law partner, 'How hard, oh, how hard it is to die and leave one's country no better than if one had never lived.' May we all be able to say that we did leave our country, our neighborhood, our church, our school, better for our having been there. And we are certainly the better for our guests' long arc of work and ministry and scholarship." It's with great joy that I present to you Ronald C. White, Jr., our 2015 Henderson Lecturer.
How delightful to be with all of you. Thank you, Helen. Introductions are an art form not always practiced well. Helen knows how to give an introduction. I thank you for your thoughtfulness and your kindness. I'm also delighted to be at this seminary. It's surprising to me that I've never been here before because I've known so many faculty of this institution, so many distinguished alumni. My life has been blessed by those people, and now I'm blessed to be here with you today. And I recognize that this is a wide audience coming from various vantage points. I'm going to start with a question. How many have seen the movie Lincoln? Almost everybody. I've seen it 6 times. I think it's a remarkable movie, living in the shadow of Hollywood, where most movies are sex, violence, and pyrotechnics. Here we have a movie with 165 speaking parts, and a movie really about ideas. And I've been encouraged as I've taken my children and my grandchildren that even young people can really get into this movie. You need to see it more than once to get all the nuances of it. In 2009, I was invited by the State Department at the beginning of a new presidency to speak in Germany. I didn't know what to expect. The first stop was Hamburg, Germany. I spoke to a group of 12th and 13th grade teachers who were invited to come as I talked with them about Abraham Lincoln. I quickly discovered that they and their students knew a great deal about American history. And I asked them a question. I said, "Why are you interested in Abraham Lincoln?" And one teacher rose and said, "Well," she said, "we do know American history well, And she said, we know all about George Washington and we know all about Thomas Jefferson, but for us, those are what we would call well-born people, aristocratic people. We know those people in our own history. But for us, Abraham Lincoln epitomizes what America is all about. His phrase, the right to rise, tells us that in America there is a story, and the story of his rise is what it compels us to be more interested in him probably than any other American. Well, I want to explain my title. I was invited by Jim Davison. Don't know if Jim is here today, but I want to thank him also, Helen's predecessor. And my title was, that I gave a long, long time ago, was Abraham Lincoln's Faith Journey and Our Ministry Stories. And the word ministry is put in there very self-consciously, recognizing that not everyone in the audience now, as I learned today, is a minister, because I have tried to show that in American biography, the untold story is often the story of the minister. 2 years ago, I had lunch with David Eisenhower in Philadelphia. David is a professor at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He expressed to me his discouragement with the various biographies of his grandfather. He wrote a remarkable, recently, memoir called Bound for Glory, which is the story of a teenage boy's remembrance of his grandfather. And so in the last couple of years, 2 biographies that have been quite celebrated have come out about Dwight Eisenhower. Did you know that Dwight Eisenhower was baptized while he was President of the United States? Did you know that he joined the Presbyterian Church while he was President of the United States? David told me that in his conversations with Billy Graham said, of all the presidents that I have ever met, I had the most profound conversations about faith with your grandfather. Well, you will never know that from those 2 biographies because none of it is in there. I am now completing a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. I discovered that Grant, as he went through the trial of his years after resigning from the military from his post in California, was living and working in his father's leather store in Galena, Illinois, where he met a young Methodist minister named John Hyle Vincent. This man had a profound influence on Grant. Vincent went on to be the founder of the great Chautauqua Institution, not located very far from where we meet today. You will never read anything about John Hale Vincent in any Grant biography, the pastor who had such a profound influence on Grant all the way through his life. So what I want to do today is lift up some of the missing people in the Lincoln story. Lincoln's minister in Springfield, James Smith. Lincoln's minister in Washington, D.C., Phineas Densmore Gurley, number 1 in his class at Princeton Seminary, minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And I do that in part to salute you who have given your lives in ministry, you in the 50-year class. Ministry today does not have the same kind of cachet. It doesn't have the same kind of public visibility or recognition. I meet a lot of struggling, discouraged ministers. I make it my business every single week in the La Cañada Presbyterian Church to say in person or by email or by telephone, thank you, thank you, thank you for those who serve as ministers in our congregation. And so that's been part of what I wish to do here today, is to lift up that story. Now, I've been told that not everyone is able to be at all 3 presentations, so let me give you a brief synopsis of where we're going. We're going to talk about American Scripture. American Scripture. The Gettysburg Address is American Scripture. The second inaugural address is American Scripture. They are both carved in Indiana limestone on 2 walls of the Lincoln Memorial. We're going to start this morning with something that is not as well known, but deserves to be well known. How many of you have been to the National Cathedral in Washington? Did you notice when you were there? You don't have to answer. That they have this wonderful statue of Abraham Lincoln inside, and there are the words of the text that you now have in your hands, the complete text of Lincoln's farewell address at Springfield. My final stop in Germany was Berlin, and I was asked to speak at the Free University to an evening colloquium of faculty and graduate students and students. And afterwards, we went out in Berlin to an Italian restaurant. And I was sitting next to a graduate student, and he suddenly said to me, "Can I tell you what is my favorite Lincoln speech?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "It's the farewell address at Springfield. Could I say it to you from memory?" And then he said it to me from memory in obviously what was his second language. It said it to me in English. So this is where we are going. And so I ask you to take into your hands the text that has been provided for you, and we're going to start. Abraham Lincoln arrived on February 11, 1861, at the tiny Great Western train station in Springfield. One day shy of 52, he was prepared to travel as president-elect to his inauguration a month later in Washington, D.C. Henry Villard, a 25-year-old German immigrant who had been posted to Springfield by the New York Herald, described that amazing scene. Lincoln came into the tiny main part of the depot, and Villard wrote, "His face was pale and quivered with emotion so deep as to render him almost unable to utter a single word." He had told the press that day that there would be no remarks. He would be making no speech, so do not expect one. It was a damp, rainy day. 1,100 people had come to the depot, but when Lincoln stepped outside to board the presidential special, 2 cars painted bright yellow, and when he got into the second, as he started to get into the second car, the audience, speech, speech, speech. And so he stepped to the back and he gave what I believe was a spontaneous speech. The man who could barely speak inside the depot, the man who struggled with his emotions, gathered himself together, and he offered this speech. So let's look at it together. It's only 152 words, 9 sentences. 63 relate to the presence of God and the connective tissue of prayer. I think it's an absolute gem. My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. Now, Abraham Lincoln did not want to express his feelings. To just refresh your memory in American history, let me briefly tell his biography. Born in 1809 in Kentucky, he moved with his family in 1816 to Indiana. He had grown up on the frontier and what was called the Second Great Awakening. His parents were Baptists, no offense to any Baptists today, but Lincoln was turned off by that very emotional religion. He would sometimes come out of the church where his parents were worshiping and at age 8 or 9 stand up on a stump and repeat literally word for word the sermon with all of its gesticulations until his father hit him on the backside and told him to go home. Lincoln rebelled, as many of our children and grandchildren do, against his parents' faith. When he moved to New Salem, by that time he had become a skeptic, but he was on a journey. In New Salem, many people said that one night he had written a paper. He had been reading some Enlightenment authors, Constantine Volney, Thomas Paine, and he wrote a paper criticizing Christianity and criticizing the Bible. And one of his friends, an older person, took from him that paper and threw it in the fire. This is not something an aspiring politician should do at the beginning of the 1830s in the United States. Lincoln served 4 terms in Congress, in the Illinois State Legislature, 1 term in Congress in which he took a very unpopular stand against the war with Mexico and challenged Polk, "You sit where George Washington sat." And I ask you to be honest, the United States, Mexico did not start this war. The United States started this war. He came home and his friends said to him, "Thank you very much, you'll never be elected to political office again." And so he became a lawyer and served on the 8th Judicial Circuit in central Illinois, as large as the state of Connecticut. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, an act based on what was called popular sovereignty, the idea that people could vote whether they wanted slavery or not. And Lincoln came out of his law profession and said that the very idea that people could vote on something as immoral as slavery. Now, he recognized that the Constitution did not allow him or anyone else to deal with slavery where it already existed in the South, but he was determined to prevent the extension of slavery to the territories or the new states developing in the West. So he, at that very time, while he's living in Springfield, he meets Mary and marries her, and first one son dies, Eddie, in 1850. And then, as you saw in the movie Lincoln, another son dies, Willie. The wonderful scene towards the beginning of the movie, that touching scene with Tad will die at age 17 after Lincoln's death. So I suggest to all of those, and when I have a chance to speak about this in congregations, we're all on a journey. Many of us push against the faith of our parents, but then life tumbles in upon us. The death of a child, the death of a spouse, the loss of a job, whatever it might be. And Lincoln is forced, I believe, to take a fresh look at his own life and faith. He cannot appropriate the faith of his parents, but he will appropriate a thoughtful faith. And that's where the two Presbyterian ministers come in. Both old school Presbyterians, the Presbyterian Church divided in 1837. These two ministers represent for Lincoln a thoughtful, kind of rational approach to faith, and we'll encounter them as we go through the day. Returning to the text for now, my friends, no one in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Now, some could remember the day that Lincoln actually first arrived. He had been living in New Salem. He was participating in the Illinois State Legislature, which was located in Vandalia in southern Illinois, difficult place to get to, and so the state decided to move the state capital to Springfield, which is in the center of the state. So Lincoln arrived one day in a borrowed horse, April 15, 1837, with all of his possessions tied in his saddlebags. He walked into the main store on the square and inquired about purchasing some bedding, purchasing this and that, and then he confessed to the storekeeper he had no money to pay for it. And so Joshua Speed, the young storekeeper, said, well, you could sleep with me upstairs. I got a room up there. You can share a bed with me. So Lincoln thought that was a pretty good idea. So he went out and untied the saddlebags and took everything upstairs and put it up there, and he came down and he said, well, Speed, I moved. And that's how it all began. And now after 24 years in which Lincoln has served as a lawyer, he is getting ready to leave. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Now, we wouldn't think someone who is one day short of 52 as being old, but Lincoln was old for that day. And in my biography, I try to show on the facing pages, the pages facing each chapter, especially as president, the changing Lincoln as viewed by his photographs. This man is so old by the time he is assassinated at age 56. It's just incredible to watch and to see. Here my children have been born, and one is buried, Eddie, at age 3.5. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return. That phrase was picked up after his assassination, not knowing whether ever I may return. The day before Lincoln offered this address, he went one last time to his law office where he practiced with Willie Herndon. And he told Willie in the one breath, he said, well, let's keep the shingle up. He said, I want to come back here and practice law after I've served as president. But then he confessed to Willie, I don't know whether I'll ever return alive. Kind of a premonition. We've heard about the dreams of Lincoln, but this is one of those phrases that kind of lingers in people's minds. Remember now, I'm arguing that he gives this speech spontaneously. Lincoln didn't usually speak spontaneously.
He gave speeches that were very well prepared. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Greater. This sentence fairly leaps off the page. What is Lincoln talking about? Is he audaciously suggesting that he is greater than Washington? Well, we have to step back a bit and ask ourselves the question, what is he really saying? And this allows us to understand that Lincoln had a phenomenal respect for the founders. He had read Parson Weems' biography of Abraham Lincoln. Weems was an Episcopal minister, and he told the story of Lincoln not even so much as to tell the full chronology, but to tell the sort of the moral stature or the moral compass of Lincoln. And I believe that Lincoln took Washington, and Lincoln took this up in all the little slips of paper that he kept in the Lincoln papers. They're called fragments. He was keeping his own intellectual diary, and he kept writing these notes to himself. He stuck them in his tall top hat, or he put them in the bottom drawer of his desk. Almost like Benjamin Franklin, he was charting his own moral progress. And Washington was an important person. But you have to remember the generation in which Lincoln grew up. We are now celebrating perhaps the end of the greatest generation. My wife's father, now no longer living, drove a tank in Patton's Third Army in the Battle of the Bulge. Well, as Lincoln came of age, they were celebrating the end of their greatest generation, the Revolutionary generation. And Lincoln gave his first public speech, and some would remember this, in what was called the Young Men's Lyceum in January of 1838. Held at the Second Presbyterian Church, it was an opportunity for the young men of the community to practice their speaking, to practice their debating. Lincoln always spoke with an eye to the context in which he was speaking. The title of his address that night was called The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. The perpetuation of our political institutions. Lincoln's great fear was what he called mobocracy. Mobocracy. So that only months before, Elijah Lovejoy, Presbyterian minister, had been killed in the streets of Alton, Illinois, for daring to publish an anti-slavery newspaper. And in that speech, Lincoln uses an amazing phrase. He remembers these men who had fought in the Revolutionary War, and then he says, but the silent artillery of time, the silent artillery of time is taking them all away from us. And there's almost a plaintive sadness in this address. It's like they did everything. They were the founders. They were the creators. And all are left to us to do is to be transmitters, to be sadly almost transmitters of their vision. But now, 24 years later, Lincoln says, we have a task greater than the task of Washington. It's almost like we have a task. And what is the task? The nation is coming apart. This great nation founded by those men is now coming apart. So in no way is he being audacious. He simply says, I have a task. And when he travels across this country, when he finally gets to New Jersey, almost to the end of his line, he speaks to the legislature in Trenton, and he offers these remarkable words, I wish to be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty. Lincoln, when he started the trip, says in Indianapolis, well, I know you're applauding not for me, but you're applauding for my office. I'm sure you would applaud for Stephen Douglas if here. I'm sure you would applaud for John Bell Hood if he was here. Unbelievable. Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address doesn't use one personal pronoun. In the second inaugural, he uses but two. Think about that when you listen to the candidates in the next 16 months. I. Lincoln is not consumed with himself. He believes he's defending this great experiment, which many in Europe are not even sure can or should continue to exist. This is why the task is greater than Washington. And now Lincoln makes a remarkable turn. I've pondered for myself, why is it that American biographers are unwilling or unable to engage the faith journey of our leaders? Is it that they do not want to? Is it that they do not think religion is important? Do they not perhaps have the ability to tease this out? So suddenly in the middle of this address, the 63 words that follow are all about the presence of God and the connective tissue of prayer. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. When we come to the second inaugural this afternoon in our final time together, I'm going to be asking the question, what kind of God is this? Is this deism? Is this fatalism? Or is it a God of providence? A God who has personality? A God who loves human beings? Well, the beginning of the answer is right here. Do you notice that this, I believe, is a God who acts in history, who go with me, remain with you, be everywhere for good. Let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Lincoln's greatest friend in Springfield, James Conkling, whose son was a friend of Robert Todd Lincoln, wrote the next day to his son saying, "You cannot believe the response." The audience spontaneously, "We will pray for you. We will pray for you. We will pray for you." When Lincoln takes that 12-day train ride, he stops in Buffalo, New York to honor the Sabbath. He will not travel on the Sabbath. And when he checks into his whole hotel, he looks out the window, and there painted on the YMCA, "We will pray for you." It went all across the nation. We will pray for you. Now Lincoln gets back into the train, starts out, very, very bumpy train ride, and right in the middle of the fourth sentence, he's struggling to write it down. He can't do it anymore, so he says to his secretary, John Nicolay, "Here, let me dictate the rest of it, and you write down what I said." Now, it is true that the newspaper in Springfield the next day printed a version a little bit differently, and the question has been raised, just so you know, we have to be aware of this question, was this prepared? I believe it was spontaneous. And it went out across the country, for it communicated Lincoln's vision. But part of that vision is the presence or omnipresence of God and the connective tissue of prayer. Lincoln is growing as a speaker, too. I think we sometimes make a mistake by wanting to posit to him that he's somehow genius. We'll engage this at 2 o'clock, that he wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of a flap of an envelope on the train to Gettysburg. No, Lincoln is developing as a speaker, and by the time we get to our final presentation at 4 o'clock, I wish to show, and I hope you will see, how he has gone so far. That second inaugural address is way beyond this. It's actually way beyond the Gettysburg Address. He is growing as a speaker. So part of my task today in our conversation with each other is also to ask the question, what is, as Helen suggested in her introduction, the power of words? This man of but 1 year of formal education. I was speaking on Tuesday to an independent school north of Boston, and I was telling these young people in high school that in those days, probably girls received little or no education, and boys would only receive an education in January and February, where they could not be out in the fields helping their fathers with the farming. So Lincoln's education was only January, February, maybe 10 months, possibly 12 months. And this is what caught the young German teacher in Hamburg, that Lincoln is self-taught, that he is a self-educated person. And all of us sitting here this afternoon, I'm sure, realize that whether we are graduates of high school or college or seminary or graduate degree or whatever, that isn't really the name of the game. The name of the game is if we continue to be educated, continue to educate ourselves. And this is part of the power of Abraham Lincoln. So I present this to you at the beginning of our time together as a remarkable address that is sort of gone, so to speak, under the radar. I think it prefigures some of the remarkable ideas and eloquence yet to be developed, both in terms of Lincoln's faith journey and also in Lincoln's power with words. And I commend it to you as something we want to talk about right now.